Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Leading in a Crisis podcast. On this podcast, we talk all things crisis management with the goal of making you and us better leaders in crisis situations. And we deliver that through interviews, storytelling, and lessons learned from experienced crisis leaders. I'm Tom Mueller, and with me today is my co-host, Mark Mullen. Mark, how you doing today?
Doing great, Tom. Nice to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Well, we have a really interesting guest with us today. He is Ed Thompson. Ed is a very experienced crisis leader who, unlike many of us, has experience both on the agency, the federal government side, as well on the industry side. So he's seen crisis management from many different viewpoints. So we're really looking forward to hearing some of Ed's stories and lessons learned from incidents that he's worked over the course of his long and industrious career. So, Ed, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks, Tom. Good to meet you, Mark.
Ed, as we were talking earlier, Ed, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to kind of introduce yourself. But as we were talking before the podcast, you mentioned now that you are working as a aircraft mechanic, but also teaching now. And I'm wondering how you're enjoying that aspects of teaching.
Well, I'm enjoying it a lot. It's a great way to have a positive influence on people's lives. And every one of the people that are in the class are looking forward to starting their lives and starting a new life, supporting their families and all that. So it's a real sense of contribution, and it's fun, and it's mentally stimulating, and I learn as much as they do, I think.
Well, Ed, we like to have folks on this podcast kind of do a self-introduction. So if you were turning up at a crisis conference somewhere and needed to kind of talk a little bit about your crisis experience, what would you tell people?
Well, I guess I'd have to say I started with oil spills and marine casualties. My first major oil spill, which is counted in the millions of gallons, was 1975. And it's been in and out of the program and in and out of crisis management and emergency response for my whole 44-year career. I've done some teaching as well at the Coast Guard Academy. Hit a lot of the major oil spills in the 20th century, including the Exxon Valdez and those kind of things. So I've seen little ones, big ones, seen hazardous chemical spills, did a lot of work on the strike team on chemical response. And when I shifted over to industry, again, it was a learning experience, because now I was running fire teams and fire departments, and medical emergency response and business continuity and all that. I always kind of finish a segment of my career feeling like I got more out of it than I should have. But it's always been interesting, fun. Okay, not always fun, but it's always been interesting and a learning experience. You meet some wonderful people.
Now, Ed, I understand, well, you retired from the Coast Guard as a captain. So during your tenure with the Coast Guard of some 26 years, as you mentioned, you worked a lot of oil spills and medical response incidents and that. You worked as an incident commander for the Coast Guard, right?
Yes.
And what other roles did you work as part of your Coast Guard career?
Are you talking ICS roles?
Yeah, ICS.
Yeah. Well, I think I've, for better or for worse, I think I've done everything except finance. And thank heavens they had the wisdom not to put me in finance. it's I've done everything on the command staff except lead public information work.
Mhm.
Done a lot of liaison work, done operations. In fact, the focus, as you get into smaller responses, which by far are the majority, regardless of your position, whether you're in the command staff or operations, you really have an operations focus. And so I've got a lot of operational experience on response. Planning was, to be honest with you, was something I had to mentally and spiritually learn to do. Because when you're a knife in the teeth operator, you wonder what is the purpose of planning in the first place. And it's it took me a while to learn the value, and it's and it's it even took me a while to actually not rebel against doing exercises in the middle of a large response. And yeah, it's so I guess first and foremost, I think I'm mostly an operator with command experience. But I've learned to not only respect but to love the planning section, because they mean a lot to your credibility and to your capacity to carry out a successful response.
Yeah, for our listeners who aren't intimately familiar with the incident command system process yet, planning section within an incident management team is one of the critical sections for getting plans in place and organizing the entire response team. So it's a super critical role. And you've got to be a very talented operator to be a planning section chief. So, Ed, the fact that you were able to get in there and do that is a testament to your capability as well. But Ed, I wonder if you can, kind of think back on some of the incidents you've worked, in particular the leaders that you've worked with over your career. Uh, for folks who are tasked with being an incident commander or a section chief, uh, what would you say are the characteristics that, kind of help that leader be successful in a crisis situation?
You got to know where you are in terms of the scale of the response and the type of the response. Um, I'll I'll try to explain. For a small response, which quite frankly, the incident command system was made for the incident commander to be face to face with the incident, and like a firefighting, like a burning building or a wildland fire or something like that, you are there on scene doing the job and tactically involved. The greater the scale of the response and the as types shift from immediate operational issues, you begin to become less of a tactical incident commander and more of a crisis manager, if you will, which is perhaps a misnomer, but you become less focused on the operation of the incident command system and much more externally focused on how that incident is impacting, especially if it's a large scale response. There's probably nothing bigger in scale than a large scale oil spill. It impacts hundreds of linear miles, if thousands of square miles. It impacts people's livelihoods. It impacts the environment. It impacts people that are not even geographically close to the incident. And suddenly, you're no longer capable of tactically running the operation and dealing with the externalities that are there. And it's it emphasizes the need for a strong team, because unless you can build a strong team with people who have the expertise to focus on those particular aspects of the response that need to be focused on, you're not going to be able to extract yourself from the details and begin to deal with the external factors that impact that response and can spell success or failure if you're not careful.
Sounds like you're justifying the existence of planning, because that's what you're describing. You have to step away from the beach and start focusing on the broad picture.
That, and you have to focus, you have to relentlessly seek out people that are impacted by this response and interact with them. I have a life saying that I usually apply to most of the aspects of my life, and that is never ask a question you don't want to hear the answer to. But in a response, you almost have to do that. You've got to ask the questions that get the hard answers and the hard responses, so that you know where to trim and form the response to properly address the issues and pressures that you know are going to come.
Yeah, your comments there, Ed, about the scaling up of an incident and being able to step back from the operations role is really telling. So I wonder if you think about the people that you've worked with who are able to do that well. What are those sort of characteristics of them that enable them to be successful? Right? You're not focused on pulling boom or moving skimmers. You're thinking about human impacts and managing a large team now, right? You're almost a project manager, project leader role now.
Yes, you are. And as a project leader, if you're building an offshore drill rig, by the end of the project, you're going to know a lot about welding. You're going to know a lot about metal forming and those kind of things. So I don't want to say that an incident commander for a large response has to be ignorant of how the response is conducted, because it's critical that they're able to establish expectations and set expectations in public that make sense. So, but they have to be able to trust their team, build a team, manage the team, which occasionally includes moving somebody out of a role that isn't doing well with it to a role they can do well with it. And so it's all those leadership and management things for rather, large scale or even medium scale operations that if you're good at it, the response will go as well as it can go. And if you're not good at it, or if you ignore those things, you'll have some issues.
Can I ask you
Yeah, go
another
ahead, Mark.
follow-up? Oh, sorry, Tom. Can I ask you a quick follow-up question to that? Because you hit on something that I was going to ask you about, which is, as the response grows, as it gets more complex, how do you decide where people should really be? And how do you decide for yourself? What if you yourself begin to get the inkling that I'm sitting in the wrong chair?
Yeah, that's a level of self-awareness. That last part you mentioned is a critical level of self-awareness, because self-selecting out and gracefully and transitioning is an important aspect. On very large scale responses for a corporation or even a government agency, they're going to bring in an incident commander that has positional as well as agency or company standing, has the financial indenture capability to be able to commit the company to those large scale things. They don't necessarily know anything about the response at hand, but they are critical to the success of that response. And so in that case, somebody like me belongs as a deputy incident commander, and I can go in there and keep the wheels turning and make sure things make sense, and chat with the incident commander and give honest feedback or whatever. But just run the machine and try to achieve success for that incident commander. So to know when that occurs is important, because if you don't have the positional standing within the agency or company that you have, you're not going to be successful. And so, and even the outside world will look at somebody differently based on their position within that agency or corporation.
Ed, we had
For example, on Exxon Valdez, I was deputy incident commander for Prince William Sound, Admiral Clyde Robbins was the incident commander, and rightly so. And I spent the day keeping the wheels turning in Valdez, and for the Valdez response, he spent his day outside the command post, going from place to place to place to meet with people, talk to people, find out what was going on, and see firsthand whether the data coming from the field matched what his eyes saw when he went on scene. That was his style, and it was often uncomfortable to be the deputy incident commander for Prince William Sound and have Admiral Robbins come back and say, "Well, this is what's really going on, Ed. It isn't what you think it is." And that
Wow.
was, but Clyde Robbins, being Clyde Robbins, the wonderful person he was, he delivered that gently, and it was illuminating for me, and it taught me a lot about what the incident commander for a large scale response should be, and the criticality of the role of a deputy incident commander.
Yeah, Ed, just to expand on that a little bit, because each section chief is going to have a similar challenge to that on a large scale incident such as Prince William Sound cleanup, as you mentioned. I mean, I think back to Deepwater Horizon incident and the ever expanding nature of that over the first 3 or 4 months. And the challenge was always maintaining situational awareness as things got bigger and bigger. And I found that a huge challenge to do. So, what's some tips that for people to do to be able to try and maintain that situational awareness as things are evolving?
First and foremost, the folks that are there facing their piece of the incident, the tactical teams, the field commanders, if you will, the task force leaders, those kind of people, they have to know their responsibility to pass information up. That's the first thing, and they got to honor it. And one way to do that is to go visit them and talk to them. In we've become much more aware of that, but there's still a couple of places where we fetch up. And the last place an incident commander wants to be is where the command post competes for information with the field. For example, if an overflight goes and collects information about distribution of pollutants or whatever, and brings that information back to the command post, and the command post fails to share it with the field in a timely manner, that creates a rift between the command post and the field that'll be difficult to mend. The real issue is that information needs to be first and foremost in the hands of the tactical people that are actually doing the work. Back when we didn't really honor this a great deal, or back when we didn't really understand how to do it well, in the late 70s, early 80s, I was on the Gulf Strike Team, and I got, from some people's perspective, a bad reputation. I never felt bad about it. I was known as the guy that would go hire a helicopter at a moment's notice. And what I would do as the overall leader for that response is I would fly from site to site in the response, get a hold of the tactical leader, throw them in the helicopter, take them up, and let them see an aerial view of what they were dealing with and what they were. And I would do that every few days. I would refresh their tactical view. People didn't like spending money on the helicopter, but it really drove home to me the criticality of information flow, and information first and foremost belongs to the people who can use it to actually mitigate the circumstance that you're in. And then secondly is used by the command post for communication and planning and those kind of things. If you do it right, it's seamless. If you do it wrong, it's a mess. The other thing, and probably the hardest thing to sort out, is information is good up to a point in time. And so if you're clear with your receiving public and with your receiving agencies that this is what I know as of 7 o'clock this morning, or this is what I know as of 6 o'clock this evening, and get them used to hearing that, and get them to understand that at 10 o'clock in the morning, the situation may have developed differently since it was when you had the picture at 7, and you're out there collecting that information now. It helps, and actually can buttress you you know, news helicopter that flies over something and says, aha, this is different. It's critical because information flow and information is critical to building trust within the unified command. If the agencies feel there is a different response going on in the field than is in the incident and action plan or is being depicted on the situation unit, that destroys trust, and that begins to develop animosity within the unified command, and will begin to invigorate the enforcement arms of most agencies.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ed,
Nice.
you've highlighted some very sort of out of the box approaches here in terms of, getting your incident commanders or, your bureau chiefs up into helicopters to have a broad view. So that's really demonstrating a leadership aspect in the crisis situation, and a very positive one. But let me take you to the other side of the coin there and think about, incident commanders or section chiefs or executives that you've worked with who had trouble in that setting, who for some reason or other didn't carry the day. And I wonder if you can talk to, what are the issues that sort of worked against those people being successful, whether their own personal issues, capability. How do you see that?
Well, let's see. An introvert can be a great incident commander, but they really got to work at it. You've got to naturally be looking outward. You've got to naturally be embracing outward. Big incidents create a lot of personal burden on everybody in the response. Everybody in that response is carrying an extra burden personally during that response. The incident commander has no business sharing their personal burden in public. They have every business lightening the personal burden for the people involved in the response.
Ed, can you be
And
more specific on that? What did you see in a command post or in a response setting that triggered that thought?
I've seen senior people in a response complain about how disrupted their lives were in public, and that's like hoisting the tallest lightning rod you can think of. It's because you're going to get a whole lot of who cares what your burden is. You just destroy the environment across this piece of the globe.
Mhm.
I also know an incident commander that got in trouble for allowing team members to spend money calling home on Christmas Day, to the ire of people who were pinching pennies, and that's a good example, I think.
Mhm.
And so it's all those things. It's your personal burden is not to be shared. Everyone else's personal burden needs to be lightened to the extent that the incident commander can. And one of the best incident leaders, crisis leaders I saw, we were in the midst of a response that, shall we say, was at least the second manifestation of this failure that was undoubtedly going to result in significant enforcement action. Everybody knew it was going to be bad. Everybody thought it was going to be terrible. We went through an incident potential exercise that literally covered the walls of the room with bad potentials that were coming out of this thing. And this person, she never lost her positive demeanor. And every interaction with company, with agency people was professional, was upbeat, and all that. And I once in the elevator said, "I am amazed at your positive attitude, and I am inspired by it." And she said, "Ed, that's all I got. That's all I got to offer." And it was one of the strongest statements I've ever heard.
But that's huge, isn't it? I mean, being the sort of the cheerleader for the responders, because when you're in the slog of dealing with a crisis that goes on for weeks or months, everybody's sort of getting tired and wants to be home. And, there's constantly problems coming in that need to be solved. And it's just angst all the time on some days, it seems like. And a good leader is somebody who's going to sort of transcend that and be a cheerleader, right? And let folks know, hey, what you're doing is a good thing. We're helping
That's right.
solve a problem here.
That's exactly right.
And I've just found I've worked with a couple incident commanders who were just inspirational in that sense. And I was just amazed at every day after day after day, they'd come out and, host a command post meeting and, be cheerleading for people and highlighting the progress that we're making and the difference that the people in this response are making. And just, the leadership aspects of that on morale are just huge.
That's right.
You-
It's a
you co-
you're literally on a large scale response. You're leading thousands of people, many of whom you will never meet,
Hmm.
and your demeanor and attitude percolates through that organization. It needs to be positive.
It's interesting how your comments match up with public affairs or the jerk's work, because um, I've seen in exercises and actual events where the response just becomes dots on a map or a chart of items ordered and so on. And so, but your emphasis on people, I think, is really critical throughout the response. If we settle down and look and realize that our actions impact people, the event impacted people, and not just the public, but the people that have to be in the room instead of home at their kid's birthday party. And so I really appreciate what you're saying about deal with the people, deal personally and with each individual's life space at that moment.
Yeah, and this you got to do the best you can. You can't be everything to everybody, but you got to carry the burden of that response, and it's not a burden that you can publicly put down.
Ed, I'd like to talk to you for a minute about training issues. And I know you spent many years in the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard is known to do crisis training for its staff. You've worked for large energy company who also spend a lot of money doing training. But there's a lot of small operators out there, right, who don't have the human resources to do a lot. What's your guidance for helping leaders in an organization prepare to lead in a crisis? And how do we train people to do that?
Wow, that's a big question, Tom. Let me think. Well, first off, trust your people to answer questions, and what I mean by that is, in a lot of times we get used to, in corporate world in particular, some aspects of government as well, where you have talking heads that I had one public affairs person make the quip that, we look like idiots, so you don't have to, kind of thing. Um, it's a whereas honestly, I think the people closest to the incident that know what's going on can in many ways be some of your best spokespeople, so long as they know their boundaries. So if you're a tactical leader at a particular site, conducting a certain tactical operation, there's no one on planet Earth that knows more about that particular aspect of the response than you do, and so your boss should trust you to speak to that, and should also coach you to know when to say that's outside my boundaries. You have to go talk to somebody else, and there's no shame in that. And it takes it that training, I think, is easy to achieve. Compliance with that training can be spotty, because once people start talking, some of them can't shut up, and other people can't get started on that, and want to shove it off. So you got to find the people that know their boundaries and know how to speak in public, and use them, so that the incident commander doesn't have to be everything to everybody all the time. And so subject matter experts that and who can speak in public, without embarrassing the agency or the company, spreading out some of that load, I think, is important to success. How do you train people to care about people? Do that every day between incidents. How do you train people to get out of the command post and know it, and be out there and be public, and come back and sit down and get briefed by your public affairs people or your liaison people or your section chiefs, and drink all that information in, and then somehow be coherent at the press briefing? That's a skill set that takes a pretty intensive training. It's hard to avoid being trained for that, because people like you, Tom, and you, Mark, have a world of experience on how to encapsulate information and get it across.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I answered that question, by the way. But
well, the training aspects are just huge, and you've highlighted a couple of important issues here. One is, have subject matter experts who can speak, and knowing your subject matter is one thing, but then getting a little media coaching is another thing, right? Going through a media training program, and in a agency or in a corporation, putting your people through a media training program like that goes a long way to, increasing their comfort level. Because I'll tell you, on some of the large incidents that I've worked, we deploy people who never thought they were going to be deployed out into the field to help manage an incident, right? And those are folks who would be back in the office and say, well, I don't need to do this training because I'm not going to be a spokesperson for the company or for the agency. And yet when a big one hits and we're pushing everybody out to the field to help us communicate in local communities along the, wherever we're impacting, now all of a sudden that person is a spokesperson. And everyone needs to have a little bit of training like that. Mark, what's your
you're
take?
so right. Yeah, you're so right, Tom. It's a case in point is logistics. It's better than 80%, maybe 90% of the responses are handled with what you can fire out of the cannon, at the first shot, right? And the logistics that are on scene, the equipment and personnel that are on scene are readily available, are able to do it. But for that few percent of responses where logistics becomes expansive, it actually begins to overshadow even planning, because if you can't feed them and equip them, you can't do it. And suddenly somebody at a staging area or somebody at a logistics site is going to become a very important person and likely to be interviewed.
Mhm.
So yes, you got to reach pretty far into the response organization if you're training people for the big one.
Right.
Go ahead, Mark. What do you got?
Well, I've really appreciated hearing this. And what I like hearing the most is, again, that internally or externally, while we may be pushing objects around the environment, we are dealing with people, and we have to deal with the personal relationships first. So I really appreciate the focus on an incident commander that listens and looks for information and reaches out. And then what you commented about taking them up in helicopters, it's always good to remember what you're doing when you're moving points on a map or putting words on a paper. So I really appreciate that. I do have a quick question for you, though, and that is, would you do this again? If you were called back, would you go back into the hot seat?
I, I haven't, as we said during the prior to the recording, I haven't done this since 2014, or even considered it, and I would wonder about my relevance, and if I got called back, um, I would I would be saddened somewhat by the lack of nobody, no resources that can actually step into the breach and do this. I mean, because gosh, if you need some old geezer like me to come in, you're really in trouble. You know, uh, it's a. So would I do it again? There are aspects of response that invigorate me. That uh, you just can't you can't describe, and in many cases it's inappropriate to say how much you love going through a response and solving a problem and feeling like you actually made headway against an intractable problem. There's a great sense of satisfaction in that, and you make friends uh, forever. Um, to the extent that large scale responses become reunions of people that you knew from way back when, that you knew and trusted and enjoyed working with, and you know them, they know you. You know when you got to cover over where they're going to get tired or maybe miss a step, and they know you where you miss a stitch, and you back each other up, and it's a uh, so there's that. There's
Mhm.
that. So yeah, I would do it again. I guess the short answer to your question is yes, I would do it again.
Good. Well, we live in an environment where there's so many different ways for things to go wrong these days, and there's so many really new issues that we're just going to have to get used to dealing with. And one of my concerns has been, where's the bench depth? Because there's so much happening these days. There's so many different ways that you can suddenly need to have literally have a physical response or deal with an issue. So I have a feeling that we need to look at our bench depth a little bit. And while we're at it, we need to deal with whether we're getting enough bodies in the field, not the response room, but if we get enough bodies in the response industry that we can have confidence there will be enough people coming. So if you get the call, I agree with you on why would somebody call somebody who's like me, who's been out of it for a while too, but at the same time, we may be like the Tommy Lee Jones and the guys that went up in the rocket ship to stop the comet from striking the Earth.
Mhm.
Old and expendable.
Well, and you
Fair
never
enough.
know. A large enough incident, there's going to be a need for many, many experienced people who can come in, hit the ground running, and
Yeah.
get a response rolling quickly, and be able to effectively manage those external communications and the
Yeah.
media positioning, and getting those press releases out quickly and through the approval process quickly. All of those are things that can slow and hamper a response. So, hey, experienced hands
Mm-hmm.
can do that well, right?
That's a
Ed, I
good
wanted
point.
to,
And it goes back to the deputy incident commander role. Um, perhaps the gray hairs, belong more in the background, keeping the wheels turning, coaching the youngsters, if you will, as they lead this response. And because, good judgment comes from experience. Experience comes from bad judgment occasionally, and uh, having somebody there that can, backstop you and perhaps, soften the downturns, and but still allow young people to gain the experience they really need to confront a complex and difficult world.
We've talked a little bit around some of the communications aspects of dealing with a crisis. I wanted to zero in for a minute here, Ed. And when you think about the public information officers who you've worked with over the course of your career and liaison officers, there's a particular skill set there, much as there is for, an ops section chief or a planning section chief. But as you've worked with PIOs and liaison officers, what do you see as sort of the critical skills that will enable somebody in that role to be successful?
It goes back to the scaling of the response. If it's a fairly small response, or yeah, if it's a fairly small response, then the PIO doesn't shift their day job behaviors too much. They'll do some media briefings, and they'll also coach management to do media briefings. Where I've seen public information folks get in trouble is not getting ahead of the response and not growing the PIO staff fast enough, and not being one of the most difficult things I have seen in a response. And honestly, I've said this lots of times. Sometimes the most difficult thing to do in a response is to get help, is to understand that you need to ask for it, and then what are you going to do when all these people show up at the door? Getting and using help effectively is critical. And where I've seen PIOs get in trouble is they don't grow it fast enough. They don't get in front of it fast enough, and they stay behind it the whole time. That hurts. That really hurts the thing. And it's I think, to the individual, and I can speak from personal experience, it feels like a giving up of control to build a large organization. There's a certain sense of you used to be able to do it all. How come I can't do it all anymore? But as the incident grows, or even more importantly, as you attempt to get ahead of the incident, you've got to devolve some of those aspects of performance to other people and let them do it, and let them be successful at what they do, and begin to become the conductor of an orchestra as opposed to the lead singer.
Hmm.
Okay, Mark, anything else?
I just appreciate that input. I think it's good input. What's interesting about it is that communicators don't necessarily focus on effective management skills. So that's something we need to be thinking about. Is, Tom, as you say, how do we get ready to do a press conference? We drill to it, but here in this point, we probably need to figure out, how do we actually build a functioning JEC?
Yeah.
Right. And how do you hit the ground running?
Right.
That's one of the big challenges that I've seen in PIO and liaison functions is, hey, we're starting today. We've got 15 or 20 operational periods coming. What's our plan? Right. And where people get lost is, well, today I can only focus on today and getting a press conference or a press release or whatever it is. And we really coach people to, hey, have a 72-hour plan right away. Right.
Right.
And I've even developed, a template 72-hour communications plan. So if I walk in the door as PIO, I already have a schedule for 72 hours of what's going to happen regarding communications. and at least I know where I want to go over that time period, right? And there's no reason you can't walk in the door as a PIO and have something like that already in your mind and ready to go, right?
Right.
Because you generally understand how this is going to play out. Um, and there will be lots of curveballs coming in at you, but there's no reason not to sort of show that leadership right up front.
And you mentioned liaison, and liaison and public information are joined at the hip.
Mhm.
So in so many ways, and both are reaching out, perhaps to different constituencies, but both are reaching out to collect information and present information, and to make sure that those things are getting through. And liaison is a tremendous source of um, surprise information. It's a great way to avoid surprises. It's
Mhm.
if you can hear it rumbling in the liaison, you know it's coming sooner or later, and you can head it off at the pass. And so it's a tremendous source. And getting liaison and the JIC to work together and basically understand each other's boundaries, but also have a very porous boundary for information sharing and information retrieval. Um, I think is also a challenge, and part of that design of the JIC you talked about, Mark.
Yeah.
Yeah, for our listeners who may not be familiar with some of the jargon here, liaison is one of those critical roles within an incident management team that's focused on government relations, on regulatory relations, and on keeping the government regulatory stakeholders informed about what's happening. It's so critical, because it keeps regulatory agencies informed, but it also keeps local government entities, municipalities, counties, all those elected officials informed. And it's the role of this liaison officer team to do that. And of course, the information that they're using to communicate to those stakeholders is generally developed from the public information team within that command.
There you
So
go.
that's it.
One of the best examples of it working well was when, as a response progresses, agencies shift from emergency response mode, if you will, to more fundamental agency roles of enforcement and those kind of things, and permitting. And as we progress through a particular response, that we we agreed that it would be a good idea for the crisis manager for that response to sit down with the agency and say, look, up to now, we've been working very closely together in public to proceed through this response. But as we go further, we understand that you may want to distance yourself from us so that you can more effectively do your enforcement role. I cannot tell you how much that agency appreciated that discussion,
Mhm.
and it actually built a stronger relationship with that agency.
That's
That's a
fascinating.
pretty mature discussion to have
Yeah.
in the middle of a response.
Yeah, really interesting point there, Ed, because I've not heard of an incident commander uh, sort of opening the door for that distancing within the unified command. It makes perfect sense. But typically, we find it's a forced kind of issue politically, where the politics have entered into the response now. And so the agencies feel uh, pressure to disengage with the company who's the responsible party for an incident.
Well, having that discussion was not at the incident level; it was at the crisis level, um, and it was the right place to do it, because then the more politically driven aspects of the agency could consider it and parse out the parts that were going to stay with the response and partner with the response and be public partners, and parse out the parts that we're not going to be partnering with, and so forth. And everybody did it with eyes wide open, and it became another aspect of cooperation, if you will, if you can describe it as such. And it actually smoothed things out because it avoided that wedging that you alluded to, Tom.
Yeah.
Good input.
Well, I've about exhausted the questions I have for Ed, although to be honest, I could talk to you all day about this stuff, Ed, and never get tired of it. I kind of just want to throw it back to you and just say anything else that you'd like to add here in terms of, your advice to people who want to become better leaders in a crisis or who want to learn how to become leaders in a crisis. What would your sort of guidance and recommendations be?
I guess you always have to ask yourself, what am I not doing that I should be doing? Because there's always more to do than you can do. And be able to have that discussion with your command staff as an incident commander and say, okay, what am I missing? I feel, one of the things I would strongly recommend is if you feel like you're being trapped in the command post, you're about 2 days trapped in the command post, you're behind it. Always be inclined to get out, be out with the rest of the unified command, get out there, see what's going on, talk to people. As we discussed earlier, praise them, cheer them on, thank them, and also get out there and take a few punches in public, because you are gonna. It's not always a pleasant feeling to be on a response, but it can be a very productive and satisfying thing if you do it right.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Ed, thank you very much for your time today and for sharing your expertise from various aspects, given your career history. Really appreciate your spending time with us today. And we look forward to talking to you sometime again in the future, if that's okay.
Oh, I'd be excited. I'm kind of flattered you guys thought of me. So thanks.
Thank you, Ed.